Yep, we're set.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to another issue or episode of the South Dakota Forest Health Workshop. I'm Tony Seidel, your moderator, and we are joined in classic fashion by Dr. John Ball, South Dakota Forest Health Specialist and SDSU Extension Forester. Today we'll be discussing, as you can see on your screen, Three Sisters for Urban Trees. We're talking about some tree recommendations in our urban landscapes. Dr. Ball will be going through a presentation here, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. If you do have any questions, please place those in the chat box as they pop into your head. We'll make sure to catalog these and get through as many as we can in the time allotted. Your video and microphone capabilities should be turned off in an effort to save bandwidth. This workshop is being recorded, and after the workshop, we'll do a little editing and put that on our department's YouTube channel. You can find all of our past workshops on that channel. I'll place the link to our YouTube playlist in the chat box here during the discussion as well. And final bit of housekeeping, SAF, Society of American Foresters, and International Society of Arboriculture CEUs are available for attending this live workshop. If you have a SAF credential, please put it in the chat box. If you are a certified arborist looking for ISA CEUs, there will be a code for you to do some self-reporting at the end of the chat. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Ball.
All right. Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you everyone for participating today. Certainly enjoy doing these, and today we're going to cover some new plants. Now, again, there'll be some old favorites in here as well, but I do want to make sure you are able to become aware of some relatively new cultivars out there that have performed well in the state. I've titled this the Three Sisters, and for those familiar with Lake Superior or the Great Lakes, we always talk about the Three Sisters being three waves that come in rapid succession, overwhelm a ship and sink it. I look at that here, that we literally have three waves that are becoming disastrous to our urban forest. So I'll be covering them as waves here today. And I'm going to start out with, let's kick this on here, with the first wave, and that's pine wilt disease. Now, we've already done a webinar on this disease. You'll be able to find that in our archives. But it is just destroying pines, certain pines throughout the state. As you can see here, we've lost a number of Austrian pines in this picture from Spearfish, but the disease is now present throughout every county in South Dakota. So what pines can we still plant? And it's getting to be a very narrow list. Asian and European pines are highly susceptible to disease. Austrian, Mugo, Scots pine, Swiss stone pine, if anyone plants that. These are all highly susceptible and can be lost, and it really doesn't matter where you live in the state. And it doesn't mean we're going to lose them all at once. There's still Scots pines down in Yankton, despite the fact that's where the disease first showed up back 40 years ago. But nevertheless, there aren't many left down in Yankton and a lot of other areas. Moderately susceptible ones are some North American pines. Jack pine, lodgepole, red pine, and even eastern white pine might be included in this group. They're only susceptible if they're severely stressed, but we certainly have had some droughts which have stressed these. The bomb-proof plants are really limber pine and ponderosa pine. If you're looking for a pine that's not going to get pine wilt, again, a disease that's now present throughout the state that is lethal and will kill a pine tree within a season, you're really down to, for the most part, ponderosa pine throughout the state. So what else can we plant in terms of other evergreens? Because the pine party is pretty much over. Rocky Mountain Douglas fir, a tree that I mentioned during our webinar on windbreak trees, is an excellent tree for urban plantings as well. And we have magnificent specimens throughout the state. And I mean throughout the state, from Lemon down to Dakota Dunes, from Aberdeen down to Hot Springs. So you can find them just about anywhere. Though I'll admit, the ones in Murdo, for example, aren't quite as tall as the ones down in Sioux Falls. But it's a beautiful tree. Quite often people drive by them and don't even think to realize they're different. Relatively few pest problems for them. They do have a kind of a unique cone. to them, but it does have to be the Rocky Mountain Douglas fir. That's the one that is hardy for our area. And by that, I mean our region can tolerate our summers and our winters with relatively few problems. And another one is Siberian larch, which was also mentioned during the windbreak webinar because it's a good tree for not only urban plantings, but for windbreaks, but it is a larch, so it does drop its needles in the fall. So yes, during the winter, it looks like a dead spruce, but otherwise, during the summer, it can be an incredibly attractive tree. Does well in droughts, and in fact does better than any other larches in that respect. Does have a brilliant fall color, as you can see here. This picture I took up at the Big Sioux Nursery a number of years ago. And then again, it does drop its needles in the fall. So you might want to think of it as deciduous evergreen, but it's incredibly hardy for our state as well. And then for spruce, just to mention those in passing, Colorado spruce is way overused. Suffers from a lot of insects and disease problems. This last weekend, what was I looking at? Windbreaks with a multitude of problems. And the biggest problem was that they were all blue spruce. If you really want to plant a spruce, the white spruce is generally going to be a better choice than our blue spruce. I realize blue spruce is pretty, but after about 20 years, it begins to decline. So what are some other trees? Well, I've mentioned Meyer spruce on a number of occasions, and you can see they can be just as colorful as any of the blue spruce. They are slower growing. They're going to be about 3/4 the speed, if you want to look at it that way, as a blue spruce, but are equally tough, though the deer seem to enjoy them. Much longer cone than the blue spruce. And then one that I have not mentioned, but I will mention because it's our ornamental tree planting, is Serbian spruce. Now, Serbian spruce is unusual. It's a flat needled spruce. It's a very pretty tree. You can see I've got 3 of them here in this picture. And I took this picture in Huron, South Dakota. A relatively mature grouping here. I think they're very, very attractive with those hanging branchlets to it. I do want you to notice, though, it's a zone 4B5A tree. So this is best left in the southern half of the state. Certainly can grow beautiful ones in Spearfish and Rapid, and very attractive ones in Brookings. But you get up to Aberdeen, they're not going to do as well, and particularly outside of town up there. But I love the fact that it has this light underside to the needles. And, excuse me, and an incredibly attractive tree with none of the pest problems that we see in the Colorado spruce. And then the other one is Norway spruce. And here's a picture of a young Norway spruce in Sioux Falls. Again, those hanging branchlets, very attractive. And notice this is very similar to the Serbian spruce in terms of growing conditions. Really about the southern half of the state. There's attractive specimens, certainly in Brookings. You do find them in Watertown, so they do go a little farther north. And I certainly can find some incredibly attractive ones in Spearfish and Rapid City. And even in some of the outlying areas, I do find them in Chamberlain and such as well. So again, there are some more other choices in spruce than just our blue spruce, which primary problem is that it's overused. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. But because of that, we end up with a lot of pest problems and people are looking at other spruce possibilities. Again, I think the Serbian is way underutilized. And for those in the southern half of the state, it is one I'd certainly consider for urban plantings. Well, the second wave is emerald ash borer. And we don't need to go into all the devastation caused by this insect. That will be in the May webinar that we'll be having. We'll give you a big update on what's going on with that. But of course, the question now is, what else are we going to plant? Well, this is a great picture. This is showing you an infested ash, and that ash was removed. And what did they plant? A maple. And Aaron Keyes, the city forester of Aberdeen, was one of the first to note this, that wait a minute, people are planting a lot more maple out there. And in many of our communities, there's almost as many maples as there were ash. And so why maples can be an incredibly attractive trees, and there's a lot of possibilities in there. We may want to be a little more careful in our selection of maples, just because we could end up with another pest. Now, we already have one, the Asian longhorn beetle, which is not present in South Dakota yet, which is devastating to maples out east. But I worry about an insect that we may not even know anything about, just like the emerald ash borer. No one knew about that in the 80s. And if we're putting way too many trees at risk. So I'll mention a maple, but beyond that, you may want to reduce your plantings of it. So kind of stop or slow down our maples for a while. But here's one, and that's sugar maple. I mean, the sugar maples are incredibly attractive trees. We do have native stands up in CG Hollow, which are considered black maples, which is by many people considered a subspecies of sugar maple. Some consider them a separate tree, of course. Sugar maples are not the toughest trees out there in terms of surviving our South Dakota growing conditions, but let me mention two. Fall Fiesta is kind of an old favorite, and the fall color is just incredible. Oranges and reds, and it is a zone 4 tree. So you can use this in much of the state, though West River, where it can be incredibly dry, the only way you're going to grow that is supplemental irrigation. And there's another one called Unity. Now, Unity is actually a zone 3 sugar maple. So it's hardy throughout the state. The biggest issue you'll have with sugar maples is it's not the most heat tolerant tree. And it certainly requires supplemental irrigation in much of the state in order to perform well. Now, that's usually not a problem in urban areas. And I have seen nice specimens in a number of communities throughout the state of sugar maples properly maintained. Eastern third of the state, not a problem at all. From Aberdeen all the way down, it's relatively mild, and we certainly get enough precipitation. And these would be the choices. And if you really need a hardy sugar maple, Unity would be my first choice, though it has a yellow fall color, not quite the red and orange highlights. Another tree we often forget about is Ohio buckeye. Now, this is a drought tolerant tree. It also shuts down early, which means what? Those leaves are gone, and now you're going to get that fall and winter sun in that's going to heat up your house. So having trees that shut down early is kind of nice. Plus, they're not exposed to those conditions we've had, such as the Halloween freeze, where we sometimes get a very cold snap in mid-October. Ohio buckeye is hardy throughout our state, does have incredibly attractive flowers, but it does produce that buckeye. And unless you're a squirrel, they're not a fruit that we even want. And of course, everybody has them coming up in their gardens all the time because the squirrels plant them just about anywhere they can. But there is a very attractive one that tends to be sterile, and that's the Autumn Splendor buckeye. Now, this is a Minnesota introduction. It can have an attractive fall color, though I'll say many times in the fall, it's more of a dirty orange than a brilliant red. But we have had years where crisp conditions cause the color to really intensify, but I wouldn't count on it. If you're going for a dirty orange, you'll get it almost consistently. But the beauty of it is you'll get the flowers without the fruit. Typically on trees, I might find 2 or 3 buckeyes beneath them. That's it. Now, the only note of caution I'll give you is for anyone who has horses. This is one of those trees I would not want to plant next to a pasture where the horse could reach over and chew on some of the leaves, particularly on a broken branch where the leaves have dried, because these are considered poisonous to horses, despite the fact they're buckeyes and horse chestnuts. But otherwise, for an ornamental tree, I think it's way underutilized. And the Autumn Splendor, notice it's hardy throughout our state, and I've seen some really nice specimens just about everywhere. Another tree, now this is a North Dakota introduction, the Prairie Horizon alder. It tolerates dry sites, which is unusual for alders. And we've used this small tree on campus in a lot. And I've seen gorgeous specimens in Fargo. In fact, this is where I took this picture at the campus of North Dakota State University. Now, it doesn't have a fall color, though it does have attractive leaves to it. It does have interesting bark to it. But I do have to note this. Sapsuckers, a bird, really likes these trees. And unfortunately, I've seen trees literally killed by the sapsuckers. So on the prairie horizon alder, I certainly would consider using them, but I wouldn't overplant. And my reason being is some areas we haven't seen it on campus, but I can show you other areas in Brookings where they've just hammered the trees. So plant one or two, but I wouldn't plant streets of it. And catalpa. I love catalpas. This picture of one in Pierce, South Dakota. A very large tree in much of the state. It is a 4B, so you get much north of Watertown, they don't really thrive. But the southern half they do. They are heat tolerant, and I've seen some incredibly attractive specimens, for example, near Winter, South Dakota. And they will take our cold, but not the extreme cold of the northwest, or even Aberdeen, where you can find them, but they're not thriving as much as in the south. Huge flowers, of course, in late summer, where it's really at its best. This is a picture of one in Canton, South Dakota, in full bloom. And then, of course, it does have those long capsules, we tend to call them pods, that hang from the tree. So it is a messy tree. There's no getting around that. It's always dropping something, big leaves, big flowers, or those long capsules. But it certainly adds to the diversity, and we have relatively few pest problems with this tree. Shagbark hickory, now I know that's a tough sell because it does produce hickories, a nut. It'll take 30 years to do it, but it eventually will. But it's drought tolerant, heat tolerant. It also shuts down early, so it's not subject to our late frost. And it's not very common in the landscape, so we get relatively few pest problems on this. Again, my note to all you folks that may be watching this from the northern half of South Dakota or into North Dakota is they get very few and far between at that point, because again, they don't have quite the growth rate that they do here. The picture you're seeing is one in Brookings, South Dakota, and there's magnificent specimens in Sioux Falls, for example, and further south, and then out in the Black Hills, where it will also thrive. Does have a leaf that looks a lot like an ash to it, but the fall color, oh my gosh, it's almost a clear yellow. It is just gorgeous. That's one on campus. Now, by the way, it's reputed to be a slow growing tree. Nobody told the ones on campus that. Now our campus is irrigated, but we're getting 2 foot of growth a year off the shagbark hickory. So if someone tells you they're slow growing, just get out there and water them a bit. They're actually much faster than people realize. And the bark will get shaggy at about 30, so it's going to take a while. And I like the bark. And then in the spring, that bud before it opens almost looks like a bulb, and that adds to the ornamental interest as well. Yellowwood, and I promise for you folks that live in the north, I'm not just going to focus on the southern half, but this is another one that drought tolerant, heat tolerant, shuts down early. It's also very alkaline tolerant, and it's not common in the landscapes. And this is yellowwood. Now that's a picture of a yellowwood in Huron, South Dakota, growing next to the James River. Probably one of the nicest specimens I've seen anywhere. The tree's native to eastern North America. And there's magnificent specimens out there, but this was one of my favorites. It has kind of a beech-like bark, a gray bark. It does have kind of a nice leaf with a little yellow fall color. The name yellowwood actually comes from the yellow winter bark rather than the fall color, but the flowers are spectacular. When this tree's in bloom, which is late May, early June, they're incredibly fragrant flowers. And I'll admit they only last for about a week, but during that week, they are a magnificent tree. And again, Sioux Falls, as you might expect, has a lot of beautiful specimens of this. It is a little fussy on sites. While it will tolerate dry conditions, it will not tolerate well, let's say a construction site that's been beat up and now you're down to no soil. It does require soil, but other than that, it does well. And let me mention honey locusts. And in particular, I want to mention 2 honey locusts. The northern acclaim honey locust and the northern sentinel honey locust. If you're going to plant honey locusts, these are the 2 cultivars to plant. Now, honey locust is a nice tree. It has a light filtered shade, drought tolerant, heat tolerant, And these two are cold hardy. They're zone 3 trees, so they grow well into North Dakota. Now, interesting enough, Northern Acclaim is a North Dakota introduction, and a Northern Sentinel is an introduction from a tree in South Dakota. It's a little bit more upright, a little narrower, certainly tolerates the ice and snow loading a lot more than most trees. For everyone watching this from South Dakota, you're planting one of our own with that Northern Sentinel. And it's a pretty rugged tree, tends to be fruitless. You're not going to see those pods, or so you may see one or two. Doesn't have the thorns because it is a thornless cultivar. But really give this some consideration because these are two great trees that tolerate our cold. Now, we do have a lot of other honey locusts that are plant in state. This is in Imperial, for example. But I want you to notice they're really more of a zone 4B to 5A. What does that mean? If we get a light frost, and if you all remember in 2022, we had temperatures get up into the 80s, 90s in April, and then, kind of like we're getting now, but then the temperatures plummeted again. And when they plummeted, we ended up killing off a lot of honey locusts. The phone rang off the hook into June. Well, my honey locust tree has died back. My honey locust tree is dead. Well, it wasn't the Northern Sentinel or the Northern Acclaim. Those wake up a little bit later. They expect odd weather. The other ones woke up a little earlier and the tissue was tender and was easily killed. So my list of honey locusts is really two that are available. There are a couple of Canadian introductions that could do well as well, but they're harder to find, where the Northern Acclaim and Northern Sentinel are a little bit easier to obtain. In fact, we're getting some Northern Sentinels here in about another 3 weeks to be planting. But on the other ones, because of that winter condition, we get a lot of nectaria canker. The tissue right around where it attaches to the trunk is very tender. And when we get those late cold snaps, it's killed, and that provides an entranceway for this canker disease, which will kill off branches or occasionally the entire tree. But it's the real root cause of this disease is, in a lot of cases, extreme cold temperature fluctuations. In other words, abnormally cold springs or falls, which, again, a lot of the cultivars are susceptible to. Coffee tree, most of you know these are my favorite. Again, this is a tree that's widely used. I think some of the prettiest specimens I've seen are actually in winter down in their park. They got some nice ones. This is one that I took in Brookings. Now, by the way, it's not the fastest growing tree. The tree you're looking at there was about 20 years old when I took the picture. And then, by the way, it started out as a very small tree, so I do mean 20 years. So it's fairly slow for about the first 10 years and then picks up speed. And so it's beginning to grow a little bit faster now. But I love the flowers, which most people don't think about. There's 2 streets in Sturgis that when these trees are in bloom, usually in June, you walk down the street, you can smell them. They're pretty nice. And they can have a good fall color to it too, though the petiole tends to hang a little bit longer. Most people don't like the seed pods, and I understand that. Espresso and Northern True North are 2 cultivars to use. True North is my favorite. It's a little bit more upright. It's a Minnesota introduction, and I've not seen pod production from this. Not to say it can't happen. But that seems to be one we see less of. I will tell you some other cultivars, despite the fact they say they are male and podless, not always are. Here's an espresso on campus, South Dakota State University, and it's loaded with pods. And it was bought to be podless, and it certainly hasn't proven itself to be that. I would be suspect of almost any Kentucky coffee tree cultivar as being always podless. Like I say, True North has been my best so far, but even there, I wouldn't be surprised if somebody sends me a picture and says, here's mine, and it's got some pods on it. So I'd be cautious thinking all these trees will be podless. How about some oaks? I do want to spend a little time on that. Notice this is zone 4 tree. This is a great oak, heritage oak. If you're looking for an oak tree that has the toughness of our bur oak, but looks a little bit more refined, a little bit of a branching habit, a little bit lighter colored leaf, this is it. It is gorgeous. It's an English bur oak cross to it. It does extremely well. This is a picture I took at the Yankton Arboretum. It's their Arboretum trail right behind the high school. And I will tell you, if anyone's traveling through Yankton, just drive over by the high school, Google it. And right behind the high school, you'll see this trail, which is extremely well maintained. And they try trees along it. Now, again, over the years, they've taken some out because they haven't performed very well, but that's what an arboretum function is. And I would walk that trail if I were you and take a look at what trees are doing well there. It's nicely tagged. I think it's one of our, think of it as a linear arboretum, but it's a very nice one. And by the way, the Prairie Arboretum in Freeman, which is just north of that, is also another jewel in the state, and has a wonderful oak collection as well as a birch collection. You just got to see. But take a look at this heritage. And again, along the trail at Yankton, this is the one I took. And lucky people that have this in their backyard. But it's a relatively fast-growing oak that's tough. It's tatter and mildew resistance and has all the qualities in oaks we want. Shuts down early, heat tolerant, drought tolerant, and alkaline tolerant. But here's one I've seen a couple of conservation districts carry, and I was very pleased to see that. This is northern pin oak, not just pin oak, but northern pin oak. And northern pin oak, there's two cultivars, Majestic Skies and Shooting Star. These are zone 3 trees. And if you use these cultivars, they are very alkaline tolerant. In other words, they don't become chlorotic like the eastern pin oak or what we see sometimes in our northern red oaks. Tends to be a little twiggy, but fairly fast growing. Can have an attractive red fall color, and we don't get a good red color on the heritage oak or a bur oak. The leaves tend to drop brown, as you might expect. But this one can have a nice color, and these are Canadian introductions and have performed extremely well. And like I said, I was pleased to see some of the conservation districts offering these as ornamentals. And then the Regal Prince. Now, I took this picture on campus. It's a columnar tree, tough as nails. And you know what's interesting about this tree? Again, if you want a columnar tree, is I've seen it in ice storms. It opens up like somebody's peeling a banana. And then after the ice or snow melts, it stands right back up. I've not experienced a lot of branch breakage with this. So if you're looking at a columnar oak, this is one of my favorites. Again, it's an English swamp white oak in this case, but on an English oak root system, it's very alkaline tolerant. We've not seen problems with it. And it's a relatively fast growing tree. By that, it doesn't have very far to go. But, you know, you can get about a 30-foot tall tree that's maybe 15 feet wide. Kind of looks like a big oval, but just a pretty choice. And again, hardy through our state. One that does get some use as a small tree is the Japanese tree lilac, Syringa reticulata. This is one in Brookings. Always has those large white flowers. It's one of the last lilacs to bloom. Good way to look at it, it blooms about 3 weeks after common lilac, if you kind of want to know a winter in the progression. Drought tolerant, heat tolerant. I've seen some real tough ones out West River. It can do it. And cold tolerance, a zone 3 tree. So it is kind of a nice addition out there for it. If you want, the ivory silk is really an incredibly attractive tree. Now, by the way, you want to get a cultivar with a tree lilac, such as ivory silk. Ivory silk has been used for decades. It's kind of a standard bearer. And the flowers have a slight fragrance. If you plant one from seed, the flowers can smell kind of musty and that, so, or privet-like is the way it's often described. So getting a cultivar is always good, and this is one that is done well. And here's another one, North Dakota introduction. It's the Peking tree lilac. Now, sometimes this is considered a subspecies of the Japanese tree lilac, so they look very similar. And it does still have those white flowers in June. But take a look at the bark. It has that nice peeling bark, hence the name copper curls. And again, I like this tree. It's a very tough tree and has performed exceedingly well here. Now, it's not a problemless tree. I do see tree lilacs that end up with a bacterial disease. It'll look like fire blight. The tree may die back or it may die completely. It's not very common, but it's common enough that I see it every year. But not enough to discourage me from planting one or two of these. But again, it's another tree I wouldn't line a street with. Of course, another pest on here, Japanese beetle, which is in the southern half of the state of South Dakota. And one of the trees it really loves is lindens. And here's a linden tree. Now I took this picture in Nebraska, but you can see the Japanese beetles have just devoured the leaves. So lindens are a tree we haven't used a lot of, surprisingly. Probably can plant some more. But what are we going to plant? Well, the basswood, the what we call the American linden, Tilia americana, is probably one of our best. And by the way, this is native in the very eastern edge of South Dakota, and apparently into North Dakota as well. It's not it's incredibly hardy, but it's not incredibly drought tolerant or heat tolerant, though this is the toughest one. But if you want a cultivar that's really tough, there's two. There is a True North that is a zone 3 tree and is great. And then we have the Redmond linden, which is very heat tolerant. It's a Nebraska introduction from the early 1900s. And if someone said, well, I want a fairly big linden tree, one of these two is what I would choose. If you said, John, I live up in the Northeast, I would go with the True North. If you said, John, I live a little on the west, I would go with the Redmond linden. And that I've seen some of these out in Murdo, which is a pretty tough area to be a tree. And but these tend to be the largest lindens we have. And oh, by the way, there's some magnificent specimens at the Arboretum up in Mobridge. If you're not aware, they do have a nice little arboretum there, almost across from the Dairy Queen. So get an ice cream and go across the street and walk through the little arboretum, and there's a huge linden right there, an American linden right there as well. They do have those white flowers in the spring, early summer, I should say, June, and incredibly fragrant. There's also Mongolian linden, and you don't buy the tree itself. It's a tough tree, obviously from Mongolia it would be. Has an interesting bark, quite different than what we see on most linden trees, but this is the one I want to mention, and that's the Harvest Gold linden. This is one on campus, and you can see why it gets the name the Harvest Gold. Now, I didn't quite get this when the colors had just peaked, but you can see that they get almost a clear yellow. They are beautiful trees, and they're not used as much as I would expect. And the reason being probably is nobody's going through a garden center in the fall, and so people don't think about them. But it's a tough tree, fairly hardy, though again, lindens are not as drought tolerant as some of our other trees. So West River supplemental irrigation, of course. But I did mention the Japanese beetles and that they do like lindens. So I do have to mention this, that in their preference, little leaf linden is their favorite. They'll just lace all those leaves. And then next would be the Mongolian. So I've not seen a lot of problem with the Harvest Golds, but they are susceptible. Where the least susceptible is the American linden. So if you say, well, I don't know if I want to plant a linden because of the Japanese beetles, I would be okay with planting the American lindens, the Redmond, or the True North. And that, yeah, you're going to get some feeding, but not the devastation we see on the little leaf lindens. And then the elms, the American elms. Drought tolerant, heat tolerant, they can be cold hardy. There's three I want to mention of the American. Now notice these are 3B to 4. So again, all you northern folks that are watching, here's trees for you as well. Princeton elm is just been a favorite, and it's also at the Minnesota State Fairgrounds. If you're ever up there, that's the elms. St. Croix elm is a Mark Stennis introduction, who was a very famous pathologist, worked on Dutch elm disease. And this was one of his releases before he passed away, unfortunately. But it is also just a magnificent tree. And then the North Dakota introduction. By the way, the St. Croix, as you might expect, came from Minnesota, where Mark lived. And then the Prairie Expedition, which is a North Dakota introduction. Now, all these trees are Dutch elm disease tolerant, which means they may get the disease, but they won't present symptoms. That's good and bad, which means they could transmit the disease, but they're not going to show symptoms of it. But the good is that you can plant these trees with a fairly high degree of success. In other words, not having them get the disease somewhere down the road. Of course, if you really want to avoid the disease, you can go with the Asian cultivars, Discovery elm, which they grow in Manitoba. It's actually an introduction from there, the Discovery elm, but doesn't have, to me, quite as nice a form as the American elm, but a very tough tree. And then, of course, the hybrid elms. Triumph and Accolade are probably our two favorites in the state. I will say one issue with both these trees is they do require training. In order to get a nice shape out of them, you do have to properly prune them for about the first 5 years, and that it's actually essential to get them to go. But other than that, they're rapid growing and they have very little problems with Dutch elm disease. However, we do have a European elm flea weevil that's on the left, and that will just put holes in the leaves of Triumph elm. And the reason why is Vanguard's one of the parents of Triumph, and Triumph has Siberian, or Vanguard has Siberian elm in its heritage. And this particular insect likes anything that has Siberian elm in its past. Accolade elm, far less so. And in fact, we have a line of both, and you can see where the feeding just stops as you go from one cultivar to the next. But the Accolade elm is one the Japanese beetles seem to like a little bit more. So I'm afraid you're not going to get completely out of pest problems, but I wouldn't say it's overwhelming for either. But just be aware we do have some defoliators for both these cultivars, but different ones. And you'll also note the Triumph is a little hardier than the Accolade elm as well. And again, Siberian elm is used as a rootstock for both these trees. Here's a Triumph elm in Aberdeen, and what's sprouting at the base is actually the root system. From the root system, the Siberian elm. So never, ever let a sprout come up around one of your hybrid elms. It's actually coming from a Siberian elm, which we often call Chinese elm. And then the third wave is the spider and the lanternfly. Now, we don't have that here in South Dakota yet. There's a dying adult of one from a picture out one of my friends sent me from Maryland, and the snails were crawling all over the place. But this insect is just horrible. He was having a big event out there, and the nymphal stage of this insect, as they suck the sap from the trees, it just rains down honeydew. And he had to put up big tents. Otherwise, all his furniture was just covered with this black, sticky soot. It's a horrible insect. Out east, you read about it. I mean, when they're starting to die in the fall, it's just a mess. And the trees will just drip the sap forever. Well, it does need tree of heaven to complete its life cycle. And tree of heaven's not considered hardy in South Dakota, but it is in Yankton. That's a picture I took of one in Yankton, and we've got ones that are 50 feet tall, 2 feet in diameter in Yankton. So Yankton's going to be one of those places, and Vermilion, and Platte, and Pierre, and Kadoka, and Hot Springs. They seem to be warm enough where this tree is able to survive. And I see one or two in Sioux Falls, but not enough to really be a problem. but they've naturalized along the river. I find them in Chamberlain too, another community I failed to mention. And all those communities, they're going to have a problem with this insect eventually. It's going to get there, and it's not going to kill trees, but it's just going to suck sap. Any of your vacation areas, people are going to hate it because think of it as mayflies gone crazy. Here is a tree in Sioux Falls, so we do have them, but they're just not as numerous there. Unfortunately, this is one where if you live north of 14, you're not going to see the problem. But for those southern, this is going to be a bad one. Leaves look a lot like a walnut, except they have these two little glands at the base, and they do have this very odd seed to them. But remember, the insect needs to feed on this for part of its life. If you don't have it, you won't have the insect. And a couple of other things. Let's not create problems by planting invasive species. So I'll finish with a tree on my no list, and that's the cork trees. They are beautiful trees. This is one on the campus of South Dakota State University. This is McCory Gardens. And they're really kind of an interesting corky bark. Your cat would love it. Can have a yellow fall color, but they produce the seed. And yes, there are male cork trees and there are female cork trees. And the females, of course, produce the seed. Smells like turpentine. You don't want to eat them either. But the problem is it's become invasive. They're coming up in the windbreaks around McCory Gardens now. And they're having a problem in Minnesota. They're having a problem out east. Now, having said that, there are two cultivars, the Eye Stopper and the His Majesty cork trees, that are male, so are considered seedless. But you already heard me say earlier with coffee trees, seedless doesn't always mean seedless. And so if you really want to plant one of these trees, go ahead, but I'd be really cautious about planting very many in case some of them switch to female, which can happen. Because as I want to remind you, deciduous trees can switch sex. Spontaneous sexual switches have been recorded on ginkgos, for example. And we do see it on other trees as well. So anytime someone says, well, this is a seedless tree, take it with a grain of salt. Many of the honey locust cultivars have, in fact, proven to be seedless or very few seeds. But on other trees, such as the coffee tree, the seedless cultivars have not always performed in that case as well as we'd like. And you might as well expect to see pods on your coffee trees. So with that, I will finish up. For those you do need the ISA credits, they're on the screen below. DS 230-010 for this live presentation to it. And that, I certainly appreciate everyone's attendance here today. By the way, I'm always impressed by the garden centers in the state that do work very hard at offering a lot of new possibilities to their consumers, tree companies and landscape companies that plant these, arboreums that try to test them, and certainly the conservation districts that are out there offering these as ornamental trees to their constituency as well. So my thanks to all the folks in South Dakota that are trying to get out of that maple box and say, well, maple blue spruce box, and saying, well, those are our two choices. Which would you like? So with that, I'll stop and I'll turn it back to Tony and see if we have a question or two as we're wrapping up for today. So Tony.
Thanks, Dr. Ball. And I do see one question pop up right away. If you have an apple tree with fire blight, do you need to cut it down? Can you plant another apple tree in its place?
All right. Well, fire blight is a problem on apples in the state. If you have a tree, do you need to cut it down? Not necessarily, but the problem is the disease is systemic. In other words, it's farther into the plant than it ever presents. You can try pruning it out, but you're probably not going to be able to prune it out enough, and you may end up eventually removing it anyway. So sometimes it's better just to cut it down. It's not present in the soil, so you can plant another apple in its place. However, I would take a look at buying a cultivar that is not susceptible to fire blight. And we all have lists of those, including in my book, Trees for the Northern Plains. And I do list all the apple varieties by their susceptibility to apple scab, cedar apple rust, and fire blight. So take a look for one that isn't prone to fire blight, and you may want to plant that.
Thanks, Dr. Ball. That's all the questions I see in the chat right now. If you do have any questions that arise from this discussion, you have Dr. Ball's email address right there. That'd be the man to talk to about tree recommendations in the state. Please join us next month in May as we discuss the 2023 South Dakota Emerald Ash Borer update. Dr. Ball will be taking us, getting us up to speed on where we stand in the state with this invasive pest, our perhaps most wanted invasive pest in the state right now. Dr. Ball,
Yeah.
where can any of our listeners buy your book?
All right, I like that. There's a commercial. Unfortunately, there's only one spot, and it's going online to South Dakota State University in their quote bookstore. It's through Cooperative Extension, and in their bookstore, you'll find this publication available, and just click on it and they can mail you a copy. Unfortunately, the university has selected that as their only venue to sell their books. So it's limited, but you can buy it through that way.
Perfect. And do you one better? You can find it right at that link in the chat there.
Thank you.
Got it.
Thanks, Tony.
You bet. One final reminder, if you have any SAF credentials that you would like to submit to obtain a Society of American Forester credit, please put that in the chat box. If you are an ISA certified arborist looking for this credit, you will have to self-report this credit. You can see Dr. Ball's code right there, DS-23-010. So any ISA certified arborist, please keep that code and you can report that on your My CEU page on the ISA website. Unless you have any other comments, Dr. Ball, I want to say thanks one more time to everybody who joined us, and we'll see you next month.
All right. Yep. And same. See everyone in next month, and we'll talk about emerald ash for all the updates, where it's at, how we can manage it. There's always been some changes, so it's probably well worth watching. Thank you.